New York is witnessing the greatest humanitarian crisis in its history, and just about everyone in the city is feeling the effects. That's because of the insane spike in immigration in recent times. More than 100,000 people have arrived on New York City in the last year, and the biggest issue resulting from it is that of homelessness. The streets of New York are currently flooded with tons of homeless immigrants, and the government are running out of ideas on how to respond. In this video, we're going to be covering the how, what, why, and where from of the New York immigration crisis, how it's affecting the people, and where the government stand on the issue. The actual figures of homeless people in New York are overwhelming. Whatever figure popped up in your head is probably off by ×2. In this video, you're going to learn the truth about the immigration crisis in New York, where thousands of people arrive every month from El Paso at the US-Mexico border. Since Biden came into office and undid Trump's policy, more than 7.5 million people have crossed that border into the United States, looking to fulfill their American dream, which you can learn all about in my latest video on this channel. Most of these people get loaded onto buses and are ferried northeast to cities like Washington, New York, and Chicago. New York in particular has certainly been faced with the worst of it, with the city's resources stretched very thin in order to set up housing, food, and legal services for the tens of thousands of people trooping into the city. So much so that Mayor Eric Adams has declared a state of emergency. So just who are these people, and where are they coming from? Well, in 2022 alone, millions of people crossed the border between the US and Mexico, going from Juarez in northern Mexico to El Paso, Texas. However, an overwhelming percentage of those people would be Venezuelans rather than Mexicans. In recent times, Venezuela has become a country rift with political instability, economic freefall, and extreme violence. Under President Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela has sunken into depression, with basic food and medicine supply drastically short. As a result of all that, more than 7 million of Venezuela's 29 million population has fled the country over the last 8 years in what is one of the top 3 migration crises worldwide, alongside Ukraine and Syria. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, it is the second largest displacement crisis in the world. A lot of the fleeing Venezuelans would just end up in surrounding countries in South and Central America. But when word got out that the US did not have a diplomatic tie with Venezuela and as a result couldn't turn back its people, more and more Venezuelans started making the arduous month-long journey up to the States in 2022. At one stage, hundreds of them were arriving at the border in El Paso every day. Not all immigrants are Venezuelan, however. A good percentage still remains the South and Central Americans along with Africans and Asians. El Paso, feeling its 700,000 population increasingly stretched thin by this new influx of people, decided to start loading them onto buses and ferrying them away to the rest of the country. The Republican governor of Texas decided to make a political point of it all by sending the immigrants to Democratic cities like Washington, Chicago, and most prominently, New York. New York City is obligated by law to take in and provide housing for all immigrants. So far, about 100,000 immigrants have arrived at the city's port security last year, and the growing pains are starting to filter through to everyone in the city. The socio-economic crisis New York is now facing is unprecedented. Because of its open arms policy, New York is now running on fumes with the accommodation and incorporation of all these new people. On top of that, the city's welcoming of so many immigrants is also starting to displease the locals. The New Yorkers who fear their city is fast turning into a giant homeless asylum, with public services being run down and no attention paid to their own needs. And indeed, with 100,000 new arrivals, how could the New York administration focus on anything other than looking for an effective way to handle all these new people? Mayor Eric Adams and Councilman Justin Brennan have been hounding the government nonstop for more resources, money, and aid in dealing with the crisis. Already, New York's emergency housing system holds more than 60,000 immigrants. The city has so far commissioned no less than 195 sites for accommodation to the homeless. These sites include old parking lots, former jails, airport warehouses, and hotel ballrooms, amongst others. A new migrant shelter has just been commissioned to open at Brooklyn's historic Floyd Bennett Field, following soon after a brand new shelter was opened on Randall's Island, set to hold up to 3,000 asylum seekers. New York is currently caught in a vicious cycle that involves opening a new shelter, watching that shelter get filled up in weeks, and then opening another shelter. Rinse and repeat. The city is stretched desperately thin, and it's taking the combined effort of all the New York officials to retain some form of sanity, Mayor Eric Adams has already declared a state of emergency and is calling for the federal government to do the same. The federal government at the moment, however, remains content with approving whatever building or site New York wishes to convert into a new shelter. And Adams' office, it seems, remains fully committed to opening as many public sites up to house as many immigrants as possible, even going up as far as repurposing the Roosevelt Hotel in Midtown Manhattan to serve as another emergency site. The whole ordeal is taking a serious toll on all involved. The city officials, who are no doubt getting little to no sleep, handling the issue in real time to the best of their ability, as well as the immigrants themselves, who are having to deal with scrappily thrown together services and the increasingly diminishing chances of acquiring the necessary documents required to start their lives in the States. But perhaps more importantly, the long-standing residents of the city. In a poll carried out recently by Siena College, 82% of New Yorkers agree that the wave after wave of new immigrants constitutes a major problem. And what's more, a significant 58% of them think the city has done more than its fair share and should now stop accepting more migrants. And it's certainly a reasonable stance considering the vast amount of socioeconomic problems and insecurity raised by the small-scale invasion. For example, of the 7.5 million people to have crossed the border last year, about 1.6 million of them evaded Border Patrol entirely, meaning these are unvetted individuals who could be coming into the States with communicable diseases like tuberculosis, syphilis, gonorrhea, and so on, or they could act as a drug mule in smuggling hard drugs for cartels into the States, not to mention the complete lack of background checks for these migrants. Outside of that, New Yorkers fear their city being taken from them by the government and given to outsiders without them even signing on it. Sure, the New York people are more than happy to see immigrants come in and get a fair crack of the American dream. But when there's so many that they're taking over every corner and forcing the city officials to hastily reassign buildings and public spaces, that's when a rethink comes into play. On top of that, the tax-paying citizens are now indirectly funding the housing and legal services of these immigrants, all whilst the officials ignore their own concerns. Multiple protests have already taken place by citizens either for or against the continued intake of more migrants and the repurposing of public spaces for emergency shelters. Very recently, a group of 200 people held a huge rally outside of an old nursing home on Staten Island in favor of it being turned into a shelter. Elsewhere on Staten Island, people are angered over the possibility of a site that would have been used as a public school now being repurposed into being another shelter location. Will's shelters at Roosevelt in Midtown Manhattan and on Randall's Island also received significant pushback before their openings. Hey, enjoying the video? If you know more about the protests or the New York migrant crisis as a whole, please let me know in the comments. So that brings us to the all-important question: what more can the government do to help? Well, we know Mayor Eric Adams has declared a state of emergency and called for Biden to do the same. He described the situation to be the worst humanitarian crisis in the history of New York. For now, however, the plan seems to be opening as many shelters as possible to house more of the incoming migrants. The city keeps requesting for approval over more spaces to be converted into shelters. When Deputy Governor Ann Williams-Esom was asked about the possibility of converting Central Park and Randall's Island into shelters, she stated that nothing and nowhere was off the table at the moment. The Republican crowd has been quick to call for New York to put up the gates and prevent any more people coming in until they get their papers, following the footsteps of other states like Florida. There's also been calls for Biden to reinstate Trump's policy, Title 42, or at least negotiate it. All in all, a clear path and solution is yet to present itself, and there's many twists yet to come. The New York humanitarian crisis in 2023 is quickly becoming a historical and cultural event. People are arriving by the thousands to the city every week, and New York can't keep up with all of them. And with no clear source of blame or path to recovery, things are bound to get way tougher before they start getting easier.